My name is Nigel Clark. I'm currently the Chair of Social Sustainability at the Lancaster Environment Centre, the University of Lancaster in the northwest of England. I'm originally from New Zealand. I shifted over to England 14 years ago. I was also originally a sociologist, but when I made the shift to England, I made the jump from sociology into human geography. So I'm now a human geographer. We are at the Les Abattoirs art gallery in Toulouse in the south of France. This is the first time I've been to Toulouse for 30 years. It's good to be back. We're here to discuss a monument for the Anthropocene, how we might make a marker, how we might make a monument to really to celebrate or to signal the beginning of this new geological epoch. As well as that, we're really just talking about what the Anthropocene is, what it might mean to be passing into a new geological epoch. I've been interested in issues particularly around climate change, around human environmental impacts for a very, very long time, really going back perhaps 35 years or so. When I began to hear about this notion of the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch that was to be named after human beings, when I first heard it, I was kind of suspicious. I didn't really like the idea because for so many years I'd been trying to move social science away from just being centered on human beings, to get social scientists to think about all the other things that happened even when human beings weren't around, all the other things that happened long before there were human beings. So the fact that the earth is mobile, that tectonic plates are shifting, animals or organisms are evolving, I thought all that was important. Suddenly we have this new term, the Anthropocene, which seems to or sounds like it's centering everything back on humans again, and I was a bit suspicious of this. I was a bit disappointed that we were after all these years of trying to decenter humans, we were going to go straight back to putting us right at the center of the earth, right at the center of the cosmos. But gradually I realized that there was a lot more going on in the concept, the idea of the Anthropocene than that. And one of the things that the Anthropocene was doing was really putting the question of geological agency right back center stage. And when I realized that it wasn't just centering the earth back on humans, but it was really raising a whole lot of very interesting questions about what the earth does with or without humans, where humans, some of us, not necessarily all of us, where we fit into the working of the planet. These things I think are really important questions. So I came around to the idea of the Anthropocene. I got converted to the idea because it was putting things on the intellectual agenda, putting them on the political agenda that I was really interested in. So I came to quite like the idea, I came to quite like the concept. So in the idea of the Anthropocene, there is this sense that human beings have become, or at least some human beings, have become geological agents. We are now such a powerful force on the Earth, we're actually transforming the Earth's climate, we're transforming landscapes, we're transforming the actual kind of evolution of life on Earth. What this does is it really kind of brings to the fore, makes central the impacts of humans on the environment. But the other way around, you can also think of this in terms of if we're going to be thinking about humans as geological agents, then we have to think, how did we become geological agents? Where did we get our geological agency from? How did we acquire it? And one way of thinking about that is what forces did we have to join up with? So in a sense, we became geological agents by joining up with various other geological forces. We literally joined forces with other life forms, and in a sense with the Earth itself. So one thing that the whole idea of the Anthropocene does is that it makes us think about a humanization of geology. Humans leaving their mark, leaving their stamp on the Earth itself. But what it can also do, the other way around, is to help us think about in a sense, the geologization of the human. So that we humans are ourselves part of geological force, and we got our geological force from somewhere. So I guess in a lot of the discussions about the Anthropocene so far, the idea of where we got our force from, often it's seen as being we got our force from using fossil fuels. Okay, we joined forces with fossil fuels that were extracted from beneath the Earth's surface, that were laid down hundreds of millions of years ago. We brought them back to the surface, and by learning to use those forces, those fuels, we became geological agents. There's another way we can talk about humans as being geological agents, and that's going right back to how we began to use fire in the first place. Long, long before we were Homo sapien, back when we were Homo erectus, something else. If we go right back to how humans learned to use fire, there's a theory that when we, hominids, were evolving in the Rift Valley in the northeast of Africa, it was a region with a whole lot of volcanoes. And there's an idea that where we got fire from was not from wildfire, not from grass or forest fire. We may have got fire itself, learned to capture it, learned to use it from volcanoes. So it may well be that our very, very distant ancestors, were living right next to live volcanoes, and they may well have got to learn to use fire from lava, actually captured fire from lava itself. So I like this idea that we may have become geological agents very, very early on by capturing fire from living right next door to volcanoes. Perhaps we didn't capture fire to use it. We may have captured it just to make a gesture, to wave around a flaming stick, to gesture towards the volcano. It may have been part of some kind of conversation to the volcano itself. But one way or another, we learned to use fire, or at least there's a theory that we may have learned to use fire through this kind of engagement or conversation with a volcano that we were living next to. So I kind of like this idea that perhaps we've been geological agents even before we were Homo sapiens, that perhaps we became the human beings we are by actually being geological agents. Perhaps we were geological agents first. We joined forces with fire to transform the surface of the planet long, long, long before we were Homo sapiens, perhaps 1 million years ago, and that we became human beings by becoming geological agents. So I guess what I'm trying to do with this is it's really important to think about the humanization of geology, but when we start to turn this question around and think about the geologization of the human, I think that's an equally interesting question, and especially it's an interesting question for social scientists and humanities scholars, because I guess we're used to playing the game the other way around. We're used to saying, how have we impacted upon the Earth? That's probably our kind of speciality, is to talk about our ability to construct things, our ability to compose things, our ability to frame things. What this idea does is to say we need to keep thinking like that, but at the same time we think like that, we need to twist it around and think about how the Earth kind of made us and how we made ourselves through a kind of an engagement, a conversation with the Earth. And it was probably at times quite an uneasy, quite a dangerous conversation, probably sometimes quite a desperate conversation, but it also seems to have been at times quite a playful conversation, because I was talking about all that time with kind of working with metal, working with glass, working with clay, a lot of that seems to have been very experimental, very playful, not done for any particular reason, not done out of any great kind of desperation, but just kind of playing with the forces of the earth. There's an Australian philosopher, Elizabeth Gross, who's talked about this. She's talked about this whole thing about art being really a way that human beings and other organisms converse or engage with geological forces, and that really art itself is a kind of an engagement with geological force. When we think about this long period that I'm interested in of kind of experimentation with different sorts of matter, okay, one of the things that was produced, that was generated, was metals of various sorts. And of course, when we think about metal, we could think about plowshares that you use to plow fields. But of course, we also think about weapons. We think about swords, we think about armor, and then we think forward to all the different ways that metals and war came together. So there's this interesting kind of pulling in two ways between the kind of the art and the creativity and the destruction. When you think back to some of the earlier empire, I mean the Roman Empire, for example, is really a lot of where the empire stretches to is to places with mines where they can get metal from so they can make more weapons and more armor. So you get almost this kind of going into this kind of positive feedback, I think, with the Roman Empire, that it's expanding to take control more and more of tin here, of copper here, the metals that they needed. So in a sense, metals and empires are very much kind of tied together. So the kind of developments I'm talking about, they weren't just happy, generous, generative developments. They were developments that when they first came about, nobody had any idea what these things, these materials, these techniques were going to be used for. And of course, they were used, often for kind of violence and destruction. There's an interesting theory by a metallurgist and a theorist of metallurgy whose name is Cyril Stanley Smith. Smith is a good name for a theorist of metalwork. He has this idea that most great kind of inventions around matter and materiality began life as decorative or playful or artistic before they were later set to work for all sorts of other purposes, and including violence. So he says that before there were clay pots, there were kind of clay figurines that were just sort of objects of some sort. He talks about metal. Before there were tools and before there were weapons, there was jewelry. So that the first kind of use of jewelry, I mean the first use of metal was to make things that were really purely adornments. He also talks about the beginnings of the railway track, and he said that some of the technique, the technology for making railway tracks was initially to make the little tracks that stained glass fits into to make a stained glass window. So for making those little tracks that you put the small pieces of glass into, that was one of the beginnings of the technology of the railway track. And of course the railway track helps transform the world. It helps the process of colonization of all sorts of regions of the planet. It has an interesting but also a difficult and troublesome history. But I think that there's interesting ways of thinking about these inventions, that the whole word invention is about really the word venio, to come, to arrive. Any invention is an arrival. It's from the same word as event. It's something from which we cannot predict what will become of it. And I think a great many inventions started off perhaps as something decorative, something playful, something experimental, and then they were put to these other purposes. And in many ways, I mean, there's no way that you can control an invention after it's sort of out there in the world. It in a sense, takes on a life of its own. So I think that the relationship between the arts and the decorative arts and war has always been very close. And some of the most beautiful metallic objects ever made, ever designed, ever put together, with swords, with folds, thousands of folds of metal, and the most beautiful designs on these weapons. I think it's Deleuze and Guattari talk about at one point arrowheads which have designs on them. So these beautiful little designs on arrowheads that were only intended to ever be used once. So I think that this kind of conversation, this backwards and forwards, this engagement between war and the arts is a very interesting one, but who knows where it goes to, and who knows where it's going to next. There are several ways of thinking about the Anthropocene. One way seems to be more about what we actually leave in the geological record, what we actually leave in the strata. The other way is thinking in terms of going over some sort of boundary or threshold in the Earth itself. Often those two seem to be quite closely related in the past history of the Earth, that going over a threshold leaves a mark in the stratigraphic record. So there's a question here for me as to whether we've actually gone over that threshold yet. Because I've been interested in climate change for quite a long time, and one of the things that really interests me in climate change, I think that interests and concerns, I guess, all of us, is this idea of passing over a transition or a threshold point in the Earth's climate, so that once you go over a certain point, runaway change starts, and it's almost like a kind of a point of no return, that once you go over that point. So with the Anthropocene, I'm not sure that we've gone over that point of no return yet. I think that if we were to go over a climate tipping point, then I would really start to think we are entering into a new epoch here. Until we've actually gone over that threshold, I'm not quite so sure. So one of the markers that they talk about for the Anthropocene is radiation that was left behind from testing nuclear weapons. I'm not so sure for me that's perhaps like a bright glittering neon sign, but it doesn't signal for me a transformation in the Earth system. So I guess there's an interesting way of kind of questioning. I'm talking about this kind of long-term movement of humans gradually attaining geological agency, how that kind of intersects with the idea of passing over thresholds. And I think if we go back through history, through human history, particularly through Earth history, we've passed over a lot of thresholds before. Not perhaps in the last 10, 11,000 years. We've been in a fortunately calm period that we call the Holocene. If you go back before that, you get the Pleistocene, and you get some really kind of wobbly, some seesawing backwards and forwards, and really going over quite a lot of climate thresholds. So what I'm quite interested in is how the geological force of humans has both helped us and been in some respects our response to going over those thresholds. So I think that the use of fire was very, very important for how we passed over those thresholds in the Earth system during the Pleistocene. I think to imagine the hominids that we were then going through ice ages that arrived quite suddenly. I mean, there's now theories of abrupt climate change, that the climate may have changed in 5 or 10 years. That thinking of a more or less quite vulnerable, hairless creature passing through this without fire, I think is kind of quite hard to imagine. So I think we did pass through earlier phases of the Pleistocene, perhaps without capturing fire, but certainly I think that the use of fire became an important part of what I would see as negotiating a threshold. So I'm interested in, if we do go over a climate threshold, go over a tipping point, in some respects what will have pushed us over that tipping point is our own almost explosive use of fire, the combination of fire and heat engines and fossil fuels. That will be the geological agency that pushes us over this threshold. What I'm then interested in is what sorts of uses of fire and earth materials we will use to negotiate that threshold. How will we if we used fire to get over the threshold of climate in the Pleistocene, over various kind of climate thresholds, how are we going to use fire again and heat and energy as we pass over the threshold which looks like it's coming in the future? There's a question of how we might use fire to get over a climate threshold, to move into and negotiate our way through a much warmer world. In a way, we might not have any choice, because one of the things that happens in a heating world is that there is more fire anyway. There's an environmental historian, a theorist of fire, Stephen Pine, who points out that in a warming world, we can expect more fire. Things will burn, vegetation will burn. So a world, an Earth in which climate is changing is an Earth with more fire anyway. So like it or not, we're going to have to engage with and live with fire. I guess for a lot of environmental thinkers, we have to think about disengaging with fossil fuels. We have to think about extinguishing a certain kind of fire that we've become reliant on. And really, fossil fuels is all about combustion of a certain sort. It's about a kind of fire that's often invisible to us because it's in power stations, it's turned into electricity, it becomes a tiny little spark that ignites the fuel inside the engine of a car. It's fire, but it's fire that's largely invisible and has become much more and more distant from our everyday life. So what I'm kind of wondering about is how fire might begin to find its way back into everyday life. I was just talking to my parents on the phone, and back in Auckland in New Zealand, they just had a big power cut that lasted several days. So suddenly they had no electricity. What does everybody do? They have to cook their food over fires. So that in the suburbs, people are lighting fires again. People are bringing together what they have to be able to make a fire, and they're going back to cooking, preparing their food over a fire. So it only takes 24 hours without electricity, and we begin to reinvent fire, and we begin to draw fire back into everyday life. I think one way or another, fire, pyrotechnics, how we work with fire is going to come back into everyday life. But I'm not quite sure how. It's still, to me, a mystery. When I try and imagine life 100 years into the future, how we might be working with fire, I tend to start thinking backwards into old-style furnaces, old-style smiths in the village doing things with fire, doing things with kilns and ovens, which is a bit backward-looking. It's a bit nostalgic. I find it quite hard to actually imagine a future where there is more fire being used, worked with in an everyday sense. It's almost like I'm kind of looking for the science fiction novel that will help me imagine an everyday world in which fire is much more of a mundane, live, experimental part of everyday life, without this being just something you do when the electricity comes off. But when we think about relying less on fossil fuels, we start to think about alternative energy. We start to think about solar panels. We start to think about wind turbines. We start to think about, which are really kind of ways of engaging with the sun and with solar energy. But there are also ways of engaging with the sun where we also need heat and the transformation of matter. Wind turbines are mostly made of metal. Solar panels are mostly made of glass and metal. They're both the results of pyrotechnology. Those are pyrotechnological products. So in a way, we rely on pyrotechnology, we rely on the things we can make with fire to tap the sun's energy. So it's in a sense using what we can do with fire on Earth to use the fire that's out there, the center of the solar system. So that's a kind of a way that we're using fire in a new way. But I've still got big question marks about how we're going to use fire in the future. I still really don't know. I can't extrapolate from the present and find my way into this future. It takes a jump, and I haven't managed to make that jump. I think it might make a lot of people doing a lot of experiments to make that jump in all sorts of ways. Okay, we came inside because it started to rain, and that reminds me that fire and water, and the way that humans use fire and water, and the way that fire and water impact upon us, came together at important moments. And that moment was back, I don't know, perhaps 5,000 years before the Christian era, back perhaps 7,000 years ago. There's a time when people are starting to work with fire to create metals. And these are people in the Middle East, in the highlands, and they are the ones who have the metallic ores nearby. They're the first people who learn to smelt and to make metals. In the valleys, in the lowlands, you have the people who are developing agriculture, and they have an agricultural surplus. So what you get is the people of the highlands with the metals coming down and trading with the people from the agricultural lowlands. So, and then eventually you get the people from the highlands who are the metal workers coming down and living in the cities that are developing in the lowlands. I think that's kind of interesting because I talked about the way that the working with metal is a little bit like creating a volcano. It's a little bit like being an igneous force. It's a little bit like being a force of nature that uses heat to transform material. If you think of the people on the lowlands, they're using water and the way that rivers flood and the way that rivers lay down sediment. And that's where the really rich agricultural land is. So many thousands of years ago, you have this wonderful moment where the people of the highlands who work with fire come down and they mix and they mingle and they trade with the people of the lowlands who work with the alluvial valleys and the sediment that's being formed. So in a way, you have this exchange or this conversation between two different kinds of geological forces, the force of heat and the force of fire, and the force of water and sedimentation. So you have this kind of moment where, in a way, the people of igneous volcanic processes and the people of sedimentary processes are meeting. It's almost like a kind of cosmopolitanism of the two different kinds of geological processes meeting. So I think of that as one of this is taking place in the ancient towns, the first cities. They're a kind of meeting place of volcanic igneous processes of transformation and sedimentary or kind of water-driven processes of transformation. So one of the most early mixtures of people you can think of is actually a mixture of geological processes. So I'm very interested in that kind of moment, almost as a kind of politics or a kind of cosmopolitanism, where the people who inhabit different geological strata are coming to mix and mingle in the city. And I'm wondering, is that a time when a certain sort of politics began to emerge, a certain kind of mixing of different kinds of people, learning to get on, but they were in a way geologically different kinds of people having to mix and mingle. So I've been thinking about what all this means for politics. So when we think about politics, we tend to think really about politics to do with territory. And when we think about territory, it's usually about the way that the Earth's surface is divided up into different sections or different parcels that one particular group has authority over. So most of politics, or most of modern politics, has really been about how different territories on the Earth's surface, how they mix and counter each other, how you govern a certain section of the Earth's surface. One of the things about this is firstly that it's usually assumed that the Earth's surface is somehow kind of static and stable. So we fight over, we trade, we exchange, we contest this surface, which is supposed to be kind of reasonably static rather than dynamic. The other thing is that it is a surface rather than a depth. So we're talking about most of politics being really just about the very, very top layer. So I'm interested in what would politics look like if it was strata, if it was a contestation or an exchange or an attempt to govern the layering of the Earth rather than just what was on the Earth's surface. And this is also about bringing into politics how you govern or negotiate the processes that lay down those different layers or strata. And I think that this does something to politics, which is quite different from the politics of territory. What exactly it does, I'm not quite sure, and I'm still thinking about it. I think it's going to take a long time to kind of think about it. But when I talked about the people from the mountains coming down to trade and work with the people of the sedimentary, the alluvial plains, that was already, in a sense, what I think of as a politics of strata, because it was the people who inhabited one stratum, coming down to deal, to exchange, to work with another stratum. So already in a very, very early stage of politics, you've got these two groups of people negotiating different strata. So politics, perhaps from very, very early on, was about negotiating strata. Something else you get very, very early on, and this goes back thousands of years, is this political and legal distinction between the surface of the earth and what's underneath. So often the farmers were allowed to work the surface of the earth. Underneath belonged to the king or the emperor or whoever was in charge. So you get this interesting division very, very early on in the political world between the surface and what's underneath. So some people have rights to the surface, to farm the surface and to live and make a living off the surface, but often what's underground, if it's valuable, instantly belongs to the rulers. So there you have this interesting kind of division between social strata. There's also a division between geological strata. So I think if we think right back to then, that we start thinking about how do geological strata become an object of contention, a matter of concern, and perhaps even before territories were clearly laid out, there were already these negotiations between strata. So I think at the moment, with the Anthropocene becoming a centre of debate, in a way we're returning to a politics of strata that perhaps we were already there, 5,000 years ago. And I mentioned before that the Roman Empire was very much about different places where you could go to mine and get different metallic ores from. So perhaps already the Roman Empire was as much about strata as it was about territory. So perhaps you can begin to rethink all the politics around territory, also being in some respects at the same time always already a politics about strata. We've seen this a lot in the 20th century, the early 21st century. So much of politics is about where fossil fuels happen to be under the ground. How come our oil is underneath their sand? This whole kind of question of politics being around territory on the surface of the earth, but it's also about strata. And I think when we start to think about the Anthropocene as being another geological epoch, what we're talking about is negotiating strata. It's also negotiating those threshold changes that produce new strata. But I think this really means something different for thinking about politics. It means that we should never really think about territory, what's happening on the surface of the earth, without also thinking about what's underneath. There's been some attempts to take the idea of territory and project it downwards and suggest that there is a politics of volumetric or vertical territory. That's one way of doing it, but that's starting with a flat surface and going downwards. I'd rather do it the other way around and say, why don't we start with a politics of strata and then think of territory maybe being the uppermost stratum, and to think that really strata came first, and the territories on top that we contest and we move across and we struggle over are always, in a sense, an expression of the strata that are underneath. Again, the philosopher Elizabeth Gross has talked about this, talking about that all political power, all the power relations that we have, all the contests, the negotiations, are really in a way powered by the earth itself. They're powered by geopower, she calls it. So in a sense, there would be no humans battling it out, contesting it, if it weren't for a kind of a geological power out of which humans and all other kind of life forces came. So what she's trying to do, I think, is really stratify the notion of human life and human politics. So I'm interested in this question of what would politics look like if we really tried to think through 3 dimensions and also through the history of the earth, that anything we do, anything we struggle over, even ourselves as life forms, all comes somehow up, welling up through the long, deep history of the earth. And a lot of the things we struggle over are materials. They are the soil. Increasingly it's water. But all these things have a kind of a subsurface to them. They're all in a way subtended by geology. So one of the kind of the crucial issues in all this for me is what is our life subtended by? What is underneath that makes it possible? And this is tricky for politics because usually politics is about the things that we can change. It's usually about negotiating the things that we can do differently, that we can assemble differently, that we can make and put together differently. This is a different kind of politics because only some of the things can we do differently. We can't really create the strata that support us and condition us. They were created, millions, hundreds, thousands of millions of years ago. So it means that politics, if there was a politics of strata, it would be kind of different from just how can we make the world differently? How can we assemble it, put together, order it, organize it differently? Because a lot of what we're talking about can't be done differently. We have to, in a sense, work with what we're given or work with what we inherit, what comes to us really from upwards from the earth itself. I think that has questions for politics and questions for how we think about power, because then politics becomes not just a negotiation between all the different things we could do differently, how we could order the earth differently. It also becomes a conversation between what we can do differently, and what we can't do at all. What is beyond our hands, what's out of our control, what we inherit, what we receive from the earth, and really what is in a sense the condition of politics, but perhaps is out of reach of politics itself. So I'm still really quite unsure of where this takes politics and what this means. But I think it means something about politics being a negotiation between what can be done differently and what can't be done differently, and what is possible and what is the condition of possibility that we can't change. But for me, this is a kind of a wide open question, because I've got this idea that a politics of strata would be a really interesting and productive thing, but I don't really know where it goes. I don't really know kind of what next to do with it. So it's a kind of, for me, this interesting open question. What would politics be like if it was really about the layering and the depth of the earth, and also about the powering, what geology enables us to do? How would you make a politics around all that? And I don't think it's really my job. I think if a politics is going to emerge around that, it's going to be something that many people all over the earth, in different places, inhabiting different strata, would be involved in. They would all be part of deciding what a politics of strata would be like. It would be something that had to be constructed and assembled, rather than something that somebody like me working at a desk with some books would think up. I think it would be something that, and quite possibly, I think it is evolving now. I think there are people struggling over water, there are people struggling over glaciers, there are people struggling to keep the fossil fuels under the ground and not to bring them to the surface. There are people doing all kinds of political struggles to try and stop us going over a climate tipping point. All those things, to me, are part of a kind of an emergent politics of strata. So all the people all over the planet who are involved in all those struggles are, to me, starting to assemble something which is not just a politics of territory, it's a politics of strata. So maybe what I'm thinking about is it's starting to emerge, but it's emerging from all different sorts of struggles and all sorts of struggles over mines, struggles over water, struggles over climate, all these sort of issues. Maybe for me, I may be starting to assemble something which we could call a politics of strata. So I think if we look back over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We've seen the Earth as an object of concern, as an object of contention, really begin to emerge, something that we are struggling over politically. We know that the image of the Earth from space, from the astronauts, really helped to give a sense of the whole Earth. But I would also want to go back to the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, where really this idea of deep time was first emerging. And I think at that time we begin to get this sense of real concern about how do you inhabit a planet that is changing constantly. How do you inhabit a planet that used to have species that have now disappeared? And I think around the end of the late 18th century, you start to get some thinking about this. And Immanuel Kant was really interesting about this, because he was aware that fossils had been found of creatures that no longer existed before. So he realized there had been revolutions of the Earth which had destroyed, annihilated all the existing, or some of the existing living creatures. So he began to think about what revolutions of the Earth would come in the future. And I think he began to really start to think about how humans could live on an Earth that had these revolutions that might take us by surprise and turn us into fossils. In a way, I think this problem kind of disappeared for several centuries. We got so much into the different contests on the surface of the Earth. Problems around politics, so much of it was about contestation, globalization. And I think what Kant himself did was he displaced his vertical anxieties, he displaced his anxieties about deep time into problems about coexisting on the surface of the Earth. So he wrote fascinating things about cosmopolitanism, about living together on the surface of the Earth. I think in a way, an awful lot of politics in between over the last 150 years has partly been this displacement of vertical or deep temporal anxieties onto kind of surface movements. What we've had in the last 30, 40 years is this kind of thinking of politics around the Earth. But really with the Anthropocene question, it's like we've gone back to these questions from the late 18th century about living and inhabiting deep time. They have, in a way, come together with the question of inhabiting the globe, the Earth's surface. So I think what we're seeing now, just really in the last decade or so, is this really kind of coming together of inhabiting the Earth as a living envelope of life, and inhabiting the Earth as a series of deep temporal layerings that have been put down. So for me, even the Gaia hypothesis, sometimes it's too much about the surface of the Earth. I think it brings into question the whole kind of geological past of the Earth, but sometimes it's a little bit too much about the thin envelope of life and the atmosphere around the surface of the globe. So I really want to bring the Gaia hypothesis, I think it's already kind of in conversation with the deep geological layering of the Earth, but I think we need to think about those two together. So really, the Gaia hypothesis, in some ways, it belongs to an era of thinking about ecological interconnectivity. But when you're talking about what's underneath the surface, it's not necessarily kind of connected with what's on the surface. Sometimes it's a potential that hasn't yet surfaced up. So it's not really kind of like connected to anything yet. So in interesting ways, I think, we're thinking about Gaia, and we're thinking about the living envelope of the Earth's surface, but at the same time, we're thinking much more deeply than that. We're thinking about how the Earth's mantle circulates and has currents in it, and how that sort of wells up and drives tectonic plate movement, and that too is part of the Gaia story. So it's a matter of, I think, different ways of thinking about the Earth really starting to converge in the last decade or so. They're really kind of coming together. And I think that the Anthropocene idea is a really kind of great way of bringing together a number of different ways of imagining the Earth, both about its kind of interconnectivities across a reasonably thin envelope, and about the things that happen kind of much, much more deeply, but also about the things that happen out in space. I mean, you know, the sun and the relationship of the Earth to the rest of the solar system, to the meteorites that are circling around that sometimes hit the Earth. So it's a going deeper, but it's also a going further out. I think all these things are kind of happening at the same time. So it's a very interesting kind of moment for thinking about politics. And really, I don't think any of us really know what this is shaping into, what it's going to kind of look like in, you know, in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Okay. Okay. So there's also a question in all this for me about ethics, which is about if we're inhabiting an Earth that's constantly changing, if it's dynamic, if it's going through oscillations and shifts, then sooner or later it's going to take us by surprise. And it doesn't matter how long you've been living in a place, whether it's 100 years or 1,000 or 10,000 years, sooner or later the Earth is going to do something that exceeds your ability or your experience to live with it. Sooner or later it's going to exceed your capacity to kind of get by with it. I think everyone on the surface of the Earth is sooner or later pressured by transformations of the Earth in some way. And I'm thinking way back before it was humans who were actually triggering these transformations, just living on a dynamic planet. Even if there were no anthropogenic impacts, even if we weren't causing environmental changes, it would still be a lot of work. It still is a lot of struggle to inhabit the Earth, simply because the Earth has oscillations and shifts. It opens up, it moves, it transforms. So this for me raises kind of ethical questions. And for me, a big part of what ethics is about is how you relate to others who have been, in some respects, taken by surprise, or you might think about them being estranged in some way by the Earth itself. So a lot of ethics is about how you engage and deal with strangers. How do you deal with and negotiate, or how do you welcome or somebody who's not like yourself? So I like to think that the Earth itself can make strangers of us, that we can be estranged by the Earth. We don't have to leave home. We don't have to go to another territory. We don't have to go to a different town. Sometimes the Earth itself can make strangers of us. You sometimes get, when there's a bushfire, say in a small town in Australia, a bushfire will burn through a town and it will take some houses out and it will leave some houses untouched. And quite a lot of movements of the Earth, quite a lot of dynamic Earth processes do this. They damage some people, they leave other people okay. They take out one community, another community is all right. So for me, there's really interesting ethical questions in how you relate to another person, another group, another community who has been estranged by the Earth. So in a sense, geology, the Earth itself, the way it stratifies, destratifies, its very own dynamics can be a trigger for ethical relating, for how we relate to others. And these others may not be other people from far away. They may just be people in our own community who have been hit worse by a flood or a tornado or a drought or an earthquake. They could be our own next door neighbors whose house has been hit more than ours. So for me, there's real kind of questions around the ethical issues of inhabiting a dynamic planet. And I think a lot of the thinking through ethics hasn't really tended to think through the Earth at the same time, that the Earth itself can be a trigger for ethical relationships. So we could think about some of the different ways that ethics have changed over the last few hundred years. I think if you go back to Europe, around the time just before the Enlightenment, there was a sense that if something went wrong with the Earth, that it was kind of God's will, this sort of sense of theodicy, that whatever happened was God's will. And around the time of the Lisbon earthquake and the tsunami of 1755, that was in a way a kind of almost like a tipping point, where people began to question the idea, how could this be God's will? How could this be the best possible planet that God had designed? So the real kind of questions there about ethics being not so much about what was decided or trying to please God or trying to kind of know God's plans, but ethics being about how you best kind of inhabited the earth and lived with others. But then I think the earth, in a sense, slipped out of the ethical question. The earth became something that you knew scientifically, therefore how you behaved wasn't going to change the earth. I think that in that sense, ethics and the earth, particularly for Western people, tended to kind of drift apart. This sense that the earth in itself was not inherently ethical. It was something that merely did what it did. And I think that in the last few decades, the earth has, in a way, been coming back, drifting back into kind of ethical questions. And they're no longer questions of whether this is the best of all possible planets, designed by God. They're the questions of how best do we inhabit the earth, and how best do we inherit and live with what the earth has provided for us. But I think that what hasn't been pushed quite far enough, we've got so concerned with the ethical questions of what we are doing to the earth, what we are doing to other living things, what some people on some part of the earth are doing that has repercussions for people on the other side of the earth, that it becomes very much an ethics which is around particular kind of human relationships, power relationships. It's still not quite what I'm thinking about in terms of an ethics that takes the earth itself as a trigger. I think that in a sense it's kind of more common. We have to think about what we do to the earth and what the earth can do to us at the same time, almost in the same breath. So I think that makes things very, very complicated for ethics. It also makes it complicated because if you're thinking about how do you treat, help, welcome people who've suffered from some sort of event, be it a flood, perhaps a volcano, then if there is some chance that human activities have actually altered that event, then ethically it complicates it. So even by changing the climate of the earth, by changing the weighting of the oceans, there's a chance that we can increase the frequency or the intensity of volcanoes. So what does that mean for a kind of an ethics that we think of about and through the earth, if whatever the earth does bears in some way our fingerprint? I think that makes both ethics and politics very, very complicated. It means that there are no issues that are kind of purely ethical or no issues that are kind of purely political. They're all some kind of mixture of things that we have made a difference and things that might have happened anyway. And that means it's a very, very kind of complicated terrain for thinking about the ethics and the political. We can't just kind of go back to the Enlightenment, we can't go back to kind of before the Enlightenment. We have to deal with this complex situation where things the earth does might also have some kind of fingerprint or some kind of influence that we have made. So it means that in a way, when we think about ethics, it's both responding to people purely because they're in need, but it's also having to do some calculations about how much is their predicament caused by what we're doing. So when we think about people who need rescuing or help or assistance after a flood or after a drought, it's partly about what need have they got? How are they summoning or asking us for help? But it's also about calculating, in a way, how much of that flood is due to the amount of fossil fuels that we've consumed in this part of the world. Has our fossil fuel consumption made their flood worse? So on the one hand, there's a kind of unconditional ethics about how do we help and assist these people. On the other hand, there's a very conditional ethics about what do we owe these people because of what we've done to their world. So in a way, the conditional and the unconditional are kind of tangled up in all sorts of ways. We have to both kind of calculate what we've caused, what we've done, what we're culpable for, what we're to blame for, and also think, oh, what best can we do to help them? So it's a very, very complicated time for thinking about ethics, and really for thinking about the way that ethics and politics are really kind of bound up together and very, very hard to tease apart and separate. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I've been thinking about the future in the sense that, I mean, I kind of first discovered environmental issues when I was probably about 12 years old. I had a teacher who was really into environmental issues. This was in early 70s, so I'm in 1973. So I've had kind of 40 years to be kind of thinking about these things. So in a way, as the whole kind of question of climate change has got more urgent and we've become more anxious about it, and as the Anthropocene debate has brought massive new concerns, in a way, they're things I've had quite a few decades to have got used to. So I'm really, I suppose, of that generation who's had almost a whole lifetime to be thinking about and living with the idea of that we may be leading towards some sort of environmental catastrophe. So for me, I've had most of my life has been spent kind of in some respects living in the shadow of a potential environmental catastrophe. So personally, I've had to find ways to keep making it interesting and fascinating and exciting so that firstly it doesn't get boring and then it doesn't get too depressing. So the way I kind of keep up my sense of enthusiasm both about the present and the future is by constantly trying to find new and exciting ways to engage with the future that now seems to be kind of rushing towards us like a railway train coming down a track. I think for all of us looking at particularly the climate change problem, that we are getting more and more anxious because we can see this problem getting worse. But most of us aren't quite sure how to deal with it. Should we emphasize the possibility of catastrophe, or should we still try and talk in kind of more positive ways about the small changes here and the small changes there that might just veer us away from catastrophe? There's another side to this, which is, can we worry too much about our own preservation? Is a lot of the trouble that we've got ourselves into because we've been overly concerned with protecting ourselves, protecting our nations, protecting our communities, protecting our families? Perhaps we can be overly precious about the protection of human life. And maybe some of the difficulties we've got ourselves into is almost because we've been too paranoid about trying to kind of protect ourselves. So there's another way of thinking, which is, what if we perhaps weren't quite so precious about life and about protecting life? And this is difficult because at the same time, of course, life is valuable and we can't not value life. But at the same time, is there a way of thinking beyond and through life that might make us not quite so precious and paranoid about protecting life, that might in fact help us kind of live with the earth itself? But I guess for most of us, there is this sense of kind of deep anxiety. And what I think a lot of people I know, how I feel is, how can we reprocess this into something which is exciting and generous and generative and experimental? How can we turn this anxiety into something which is creative? And it may mean that we actually have to take risks and not be so precious about protecting and salvaging and sustaining everything, that we may actually, in a strange kind of way, let some things go in order to actually to survive and to generate something which is more enduring and livable, which sounds awfully like some kind of notion of sacrifice. But the whole notion of sacrifice is really interesting because it's really about gestures which are not just about self-preservation, which are not just about calculating. Sacrifice is always an opening to the unknown. And I think that really it's about finding ways that are creative and opening to the unknown. And in a sense, when I was talking about a kind of a generosity or a hospitality and ethics to those who have been made strange by the earth itself. That in itself is a kind of an engagement with the unknown, a kind of welcoming of strangers, but also a welcoming of what is strange. So in a way, what we need to do is embrace the strangeness of the present and the near future in ways that hopefully we can process fear and anxiety into something which is much more kind of generous and creative.